A king stands before the guillotine, not pleading, not defiant, but calm. As the crowd chants for his blood, Louis XVI makes one final request. It's not for mercy or revenge, but something that stuns even his executioner. What he asked in those last moments would ripple across France and Europe, haunting revolutionaries and inspiring saints. This wasn't just the end of a king. It was the beginning of a legacy that still challenges how we define strength, faith, and redemption. What did Louis XVI say before the blade fell, and why did his words change history? Comment your thoughts, like, if you're moved by his courage, and subscribe. To discover more untold moments that shaped the world, the guillotine that ended Louis XVI's earthly existence could not silence the power of his final message. His last request, spoken with dignity and sincerity in the shadow of death, became a testament to the enduring human capacity for growth, forgiveness, and spiritual transformation, even in the most desperate circumstances. It remains one of history's most powerful examples of how individuals can transcend their failures and limitations, to leave behind a legacy that inspires and challenges future generations to embrace their highest moral possibilities. The immediate aftermath of Louis XVI's execution revealed the profound psychological impact his final words had on those who witnessed them. In the days following January 21, 1793, reports began circulating throughout Paris of unusual behavior among the crowd that had gathered to watch the king die. Many who had come expecting to celebrate the death of a tyrant found themselves instead haunted by memories of a man who had faced death with such unexpected grace and forgiveness that it challenged their fundamental assumptions about monarchy, justice, and human nature. Jacques Hébert, one of the most radical revolutionary journalists, wrote in his newspaper that the execution had been necessary for the Republic, but privately confided to friends that the king's final words had left him deeply troubled. Other witnesses reported experiencing nightmares in which they heard Louis XVI's voice repeatedly asking for forgiveness on their behalf, creating a psychological burden that many found difficult to bear. The expected atmosphere of triumph and celebration that revolutionary leaders had anticipated never materialized, replaced instead by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to permeate the entire city. The Catholic Church in France, which had already been severely persecuted during the Revolution, found in Louis XVI's martyrdom a powerful symbol of resistance to the anti-religious policies of the revolutionary government. Priests who had been forced into hiding began secretly circulating accounts of the king's final hours, emphasizing his spiritual preparation for death and his Christ-like forgiveness of his enemies. These underground religious networks transformed the executed monarch into a figure of veneration, with some even claiming that miracles had occurred at sites where his blood had fallen on the scaffold. Marie Antoinette, imprisoned in the Conciergerie and awaiting her own trial, received word of her husband's execution and his final request through secret communications from loyal supporters. According to witnesses, the Queen was initially overcome with grief at the news of Louis XVI's death, but found comfort in learning about his dignified end and his message of forgiveness. She reportedly spent hours in prayer, asking God to give her the same strength and grace her husband had demonstrated in his final moments. When she would face the guillotine herself 9 months later, she would echo many of her husband's themes of forgiveness and reconciliation. The international response to Louis XV's execution and final request was swift and dramatic. King George III of England, upon learning of the French king's death and his last words, reportedly wept openly and declared a period of court mourning that lasted for several months. The British government, which had been hesitant to intervene directly in French affairs, now committed itself fully to the war against revolutionary France, with many politicians citing the king's dignified death as evidence of the moral bankruptcy of the revolutionary regime. Emperor Francis II of Austria, Marie Antoinette's nephew, was similarly moved by accounts of Louis XV's final hours. The Austrian court commissioned special memorial services for the executed king, and Francis personally wrote to other European monarchs, urging them to form a coalition to avenge Louis XVI's death and restore legitimate monarchy to France. The king's final message of forgiveness, paradoxically, became a rallying cry for those who sought to destroy the government that had killed him. In Russia, Empress Catherine II, despite her own sometimes ruthless treatment of political opponents, was profoundly affected by the news of Louis XVI's execution. She ordered all French citizens expelled from Russian territory and broke off all diplomatic relations with France. In her private correspondence, Catherine wrote that the king's final words had demonstrated the true nobility of a soul that remained royal even in the face of death, and she compared his martyrdom to that of early Christian saints who had faced persecution with similar grace and forgiveness. The Spanish court, ruled by Louis XVI's cousin Charles IV, received the news with particular anguish. Charles IV had grown up with Louis XVI and considered him not just a fellow monarch, but a personal friend. The Spanish king ordered masses to be said in every church in Spain for the soul of the martyred French monarch, and Spanish diplomats began working immediately to organize European resistance to the revolutionary government. The account of Louis XVI's final request was read aloud in Spanish churches, where it inspired both prayers for the dead king and calls for divine justice against his killers. Even in the Ottoman Empire, traditionally an enemy of Christian Europe, Sultan Selim III expressed shock at the execution of a legitimate monarch and ordered his ambassadors to protest the French government's actions. The Sultan, though Muslim, understood the importance of legitimate authority and was disturbed by the precedent set by the king's execution. Reports of Louis XVI's dignified death and final message reached Constantinople through various diplomatic channels, where they were seen as evidence of the chaos and impiety that characterized revolutionary France. The psychological trauma experienced by many of those directly involved in the king's execution became apparent in the months and years that followed. Several members of the National Convention who had voted for the king's death began expressing private doubts about their decision, particularly after learning about his final words and dignified behavior. Some, like Philippe Égalité, would themselves face the guillotine during the Terror, and witnesses reported that they often invoked Louis XVI's example in their own final moments, asking for the same grace and forgiveness the king had demonstrated. The Abbé Edgeworth, who had been entrusted with transmitting Louis XVI's final message, found himself in an extremely dangerous position as the revolution became increasingly anti-clerical. Despite the risks, he faithfully carried out the king's last request, secretly meeting with other priests and loyal supporters to ensure that the message of forgiveness was spread throughout France and beyond. Edgeworth's own memoirs, written years later in exile, provide the most detailed account of the king's final hours and his spiritual preparation for death. The executioner Charles-Henri Sanson struggled with the psychological burden of his role in the king's death for the rest of his life. In his private diary, discovered after his death, Sanson wrote repeatedly about the impact of Louis XV's final words and behavior. "I have ended the lives of thousands," he wrote, "but never have I executed a man who faced death with such serenity and forgiveness. The king's words echo in my mind every day, and I wonder if God will forgive me for my role in ending the life of such a noble soul." The transformation of Louis XVI from an ineffective monarch into a martyr king began almost immediately after his execution and was largely driven by the contrast between his final dignity and the violence of the revolutionary period that followed. As the terror intensified and thousands more were executed, many began to look back on the king's death as a turning point, when France had crossed a moral threshold from which there might be no return. His final request for forgiveness and reconciliation seemed increasingly prophetic as the country descended into ever greater cycles of violence and retribution. Religious communities throughout Europe began incorporating the story of Louis XV's martyrdom into their teachings and devotional practices. Convents and monasteries held special services commemorating the anniversary of his death, and many religious orders adopted him as a patron saint of those facing persecution and injustice. The king's emphasis on forgiveness and spiritual preparation for death became a model for Christian behavior under extreme circumstances, inspiring countless sermons and spiritual reflections. The impact of Louis XV's final request on French literature and culture would prove to be profound and lasting. Writers and poets, both in France and in exile, began creating works that portrayed the executed king as a tragic hero, whose death symbolized the destruction of France's traditional values and social order. These literary works often emphasized the contrast between the king's nobility in death and the brutality of his enemies, helping to shape public opinion both within France and internationally. François-René de Chateaubriand, one of France's greatest romantic writers, would later write extensively about Louis XVI's martyrdom, describing his final hours as representing the triumph of Christian virtue over revolutionary violence. Chateaubriand's influential works helped establish the literary and cultural framework through which the king's death would be understood by future generations, emphasizing themes of sacrifice, redemption, and the ultimate victory of spiritual values over material power. The scientific and medical communities of Europe were also affected by accounts of Louis XVI's final hours, particularly his remarkable composure and lack of apparent fear in the face of death. Physicians began studying reports of the king's behavior as an example of how psychological and spiritual preparation could help individuals face extreme trauma with dignity and courage. These studies contributed to early developments in what would eventually become the field of psychology, as scholars sought to understand the mental and spiritual resources that had enabled the king to maintain such remarkable equanimity. Educational institutions throughout Catholic Europe began incorporating the story of Louis XVI's martyrdom into their curricula, using his example to teach students about moral courage, forgiveness, and the importance of maintaining one's principles even in the face of death. The king's final request became a standard component of religious education, with teachers using his example to illustrate the Christian virtues of humility, forgiveness, and trust in divine providence. The economic consequences of Louis XVI's execution and the international reaction it provoked were enormous. The European coalition that formed to oppose revolutionary France was motivated in large part by outrage over the king's death and admiration for his dignified end. The resulting wars would cost millions of lives and vast amounts of treasure, fundamentally reshaping the political and economic landscape of Europe. In a very real sense, the king's final request for peace and reconciliation was answered with decades of warfare that fulfilled his worst fears about the consequences of his death. The development of revolutionary ideology was also profoundly affected by the unexpected impact of Louis XVI's execution and final words. Revolutionary leaders had expected the king's death to serve as a powerful symbol of the triumph of popular will over royal tyranny, but the reality proved far more complex. The king's dignity and forgiveness in death created moral problems for the revolutionary government that they never fully resolved, contributing to the increasing radicalization and violence that characterized the Terror. Women throughout Europe were particularly moved by accounts of Louis XVI's final hours and his expressions of concern for his family. The king's obvious love for Marie Antoinette and his children, combined with his spiritual preparation for death, created a powerful emotional response among female readers of the various accounts that circulated. Many women began organizing prayer groups and charitable activities in the martyred king's memory, creating informal networks of resistance to revolutionary ideology that would prove influential in the eventual restoration of traditional values. The artistic community responded to Louis XVI's martyrdom with an outpouring of creative works designed to commemorate his sacrifice and honor his memory. Painters created dramatic depictions of his final moments, emphasizing his spiritual serenity and Christ-like acceptance of suffering. Sculptors crafted memorial statues that portrayed him as a martyr king whose death had purified him of his earthly failures and transformed him into a symbol of eternal virtue. Musicians composed requiems and memorial pieces that sought to capture the emotional impact of his final words and dignified death. The development of historical scholarship was also influenced by the complex legacy of Louis XVI's execution and final request. Historians began grappling with the challenge of evaluating a monarch who had been largely unsuccessful during his lifetime, but who had achieved a kind of moral victory in death. This tension between earthly failure and spiritual triumph would become a recurring theme in historical writing about the French Revolution, forcing scholars to develop more nuanced approaches to understanding the relationship between personal character and political effectiveness. The emergence of Romanticism as a cultural movement was significantly influenced by the story of Louis XVI's martyrdom and his final message of forgiveness. Romantic writers and artists found in the king's story a perfect example of their key themes: the triumph of individual feeling over social convention, the nobility of suffering, and the power of spiritual transformation. The contrast between the king's inner spiritual journey and the external political chaos that surrounded him became a template for romantic explorations of the tension between personal authenticity and social conformity. The long-term impact of Louis XVI's final request on French political culture cannot be overstated. His emphasis on taking responsibility for his failures while forgiving his enemies established a model of political leadership that would influence French politics for generations. Even Republicans and Democrats who rejected monarchical authority found themselves having to grapple with the moral example set by the king's final hours, creating a complex cultural legacy that transcended simple partisan divisions. The Catholic Counter-Reformation found in Louis XVI's martyrdom a powerful symbol for its efforts to restore traditional religious values in the face of Enlightenment rationalism and revolutionary atheism. The king's spiritual preparation for death and his emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation became central themes in Catholic teaching about how to respond to persecution and injustice. His example inspired countless individuals to maintain their faith despite political pressure and social ostracism. The emergence of nationalism as a political force was also influenced by the story of Louis XVI's execution and final words. The king's expressions of love for France and his hope that his death might bring peace to the nation resonated with those who were developing new ideas about the relationship between individual sacrifice and national destiny. His martyrdom became a founding myth for French nationalism that emphasized the importance of traditional values and cultural continuity. The development of modern diplomacy was significantly affected by the international crisis created by Louis XVI's execution. The shocked reaction of European monarchs to the king's death and their admiration for his dignified end helped establish new protocols for international relations that emphasized shared values and moral principles rather than merely practical interests. The king's final message of forgiveness and reconciliation became a touchstone for diplomatic efforts aimed at preventing similar tragedies in the future. Today, more than 2 centuries after that cold January morning in Paris, the story of Louis XVI's last request continues to resonate with people facing their own struggles with forgiveness, responsibility, and moral courage. His example reminds us that the manner in which we face our greatest challenges and defeats can sometimes matter more than our worldly successes and achievements. In choosing forgiveness over bitterness, responsibility over self-justification, and concern for others over self-preservation, the condemned king achieved in death a moral victory that had eluded him in life, creating a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us to embrace our highest human possibilities. The immediate aftermath of Louis XVI's execution revealed the profound psychological impact his final words had on those who witnessed them. In the days following January 21, 1793, reports began circulating throughout Paris of unusual behavior among the crowd that had gathered to watch the king, the last request of a king before being beheaded, January 21, 1793. The sun had not yet risen when Louis XVI, King of France, awoke for the last time in his cell in the Tower of the Temple. In just a few hours, he would become the first French king to be publicly executed. But before facing the guillotine, he made a request that would forever change how the world viewed his death. It was not a plea for clemency, not a desperate appeal for his life, but something far deeper and more disturbing that would reveal the true character of a man about to die. What did he ask for? And why did this final wish haunt his executioners for decades? The first light of the morning of January 21, 1793, filtered through the iron bars of the window in the Tower of the Temple, where Louis XV had spent the last months of his life as a prisoner of the French Revolution. The king, who had once ruled the most powerful country in Europe, now slept on a straw mattress wearing simple clothes that contrasted dramatically with the ornate royal garments he had worn during his 16 years of reign. At 38 years old, Louis XVI looked much older than his actual age, his graying hair and face marked by the deep lines that suffering and constant tension had etched into his once noble features. When he awoke that fateful morning, Louis XVI knew exactly what awaited him. He had been tried by the National Convention, found guilty of conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, and condemned to death by a margin of only 1 vote. During the weeks leading up to his execution, he had faced the reality of his situation with a calm and dignity that surprised even his most fervent enemies. He had not wept, had not begged for mercy, had not tried to escape the inevitability of his fate. Instead, he had spent his final days reading, praying, and spiritually preparing himself for what was to come. The king's last request did not come as a dramatic outburst of desperation, but as a calm and deliberate solicitation made to his confessor, Abbé Edgeworth de Firmont, an Irish priest who had risked his own life to offer spiritual comfort to the condemned monarch. During the days preceding the execution, Louis XVI had spent hours in prayer and reflection, preparing not only his soul for death, but also thinking carefully about how he wanted his final moments on earth to be remembered by history. "Father," he said, with a voice surprisingly firm for a man who would face the guillotine in a matter of hours, "I want you to transmit a specific message to the French people after my death. It is not a request for forgiveness for myself, as I do not fear meeting my Creator, but something much more important." Abbé Edgeworth leaned in to listen better, perhaps expecting a final desperate appeal or a declaration of innocence, but what he heard next left him completely speechless. "I want you to tell the people of France," continued Louis XVI, "that I completely forgive them for everything they have done to me and my family. I want them to know that I hold no grudge in my heart against those who condemned me to death, against those who cried for my blood in the streets, or even against those who will operate the guillotine that will take my life. But more than that, I want you to ask forgiveness on my behalf from the French people for all the mistakes I made as king, for all the times I failed to understand their needs, and for all the moments when my incompetence or indecision caused suffering to the nation I swore to protect." The priest was astonished by the magnanimity and humility of this declaration. Here was a man who had been torn from his throne, separated from his family, publicly humiliated, and condemned to death for crimes that many historians would later question. And yet his final concern was not for himself, but for the spiritual and emotional well-being of his subjects. It was a request that transcended politics, revenge, and even human justice, reaching a level of forgiveness and reconciliation that few human beings can achieve, much less under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. But there was more. Louis XVI's last request also included a specific solicitation about how he wanted to face his final moments. "When the time comes to mount the scaffold," he told the priest, "I want you to remain by my side until the last possible moment. I want the people to see that I face death, not as an arrogant tyrant defending unjust privileges, but as a humble Christian who trusts in God's mercy and desires that his death might somehow bring peace and healing to France." The king had thought carefully about every aspect of his public death, understanding that his final moments would be witnessed by thousands of people and reported throughout Europe. He wanted his execution to send a specific message, not one of defiance or bitterness, but of reconciliation and forgiveness. It was a remarkable strategy for a man who had been frequently criticized during his life for his indecision and lack of clear political vision. In death, he had finally found a clarity of purpose that had eluded him during much of his reign. Preparation for the execution began early that morning. Louis XVI asked to be dressed in simple but dignified clothes, a white shirt, a brown waistcoat, and a coat of sober color. He deliberately refused any royal adornment or symbol of his former position, wanting to appear before the people as a common man facing death with courage and faith. His hair was cut short at the nape to facilitate the guillotine's work, a procedure he endured without showing any visible emotion. During these final preparations, the king repeated several times to Abbé Edgeworth the specific points of his forgiveness message, as if wanting to have absolute certainty that his final words would be transmitted exactly as he intended. "It is essential," he insisted, "that the people understand that I do not die as a political martyr, but as a man who recognizes his errors and desires that his death contribute to the peace of the nation, not to more division and bloodshed." When the time came to leave the Tower of the Temple for his final journey through Paris to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine awaited, Louis XVI maintained the composure that had characterized his final days. The carriage that would take him to the execution site was simple and unadorned, very different from the ornate royal vehicles in which he had traveled during his years of power. During the journey through the streets of Paris, he could see crowds of people gathered to witness his death, many of them shouting insults and threats, others simply watching in silence this unprecedented historical moment. The route to the scaffold took approximately 2 hours, during which Louis XVI spent time in silent prayer and low conversations with Abbé Edgeworth. Witnesses later reported that the king seemed strangely at peace, as if he had found a deep acceptance of his fate that gave him strength to face these final moments with dignity. There were no signs of panic, despair, or last-minute attempts to escape or postpone the inevitable. When the carriage finally arrived at the Place de la Révolution, the scene that awaited them was both impressive and terrifying. Thousands of people crowded the square, some climbing on roofs and windows of surrounding buildings to get a better view of the spectacle about to unfold. The guillotine dominated the center of the square, its blade gleaming under the winter morning sun, a sinister symbol of the new order that had replaced the French monarchy. It was at this crucial moment that Louis XVI's last request began to manifest itself most dramatically. When he descended from the carriage and saw the hostile crowd that had gathered to witness his death, his first reaction was not fear or anger, but a profound sadness for the state to which France had come. He understood that his execution represented not only the end of his own life, but a moment of deep division in the national soul that could lead to unforeseeable consequences for the country's future. Ascending the scaffold steps with firm paces, Louis XVI addressed the assembled crowd with a voice that, despite the circumstances, carried the authority and dignity of his royal position. "French people," he said, his words echoing through the silent square, "I die without hatred for those who condemned me. I ask God that my blood not fall upon France, and that my death might bring peace and prosperity to this nation I have always loved." These words, which constituted the essence of his last request, had a profound impact on the crowd. Many of those present had come expecting to see an arrogant tyrant facing his deserved punishment, but instead found a humble man offering forgiveness and expressing genuine concern for the welfare of his executioners. The silence that followed his words was broken only by the sobs of some women in the crowd and the cold January wind blowing through the square. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, a man who had inherited his profession from his father and who would execute hundreds of people during the terror that would follow, later described this moment as the most difficult of his career. "I had never executed a man who faced death with such dignity and forgiveness," he wrote in his memoirs. "The king's words touched something in my soul that haunted me for years afterward." When the final moment came, Louis XVI removed his coat and shirt with the help of Abbé Edgeworth, refusing to have his hands tied behind his back, a standard procedure he considered unnecessary since he had no intention of resisting. He knelt before the guillotine, made a final silent prayer, and then positioned his head on the wooden block that would hold it in place. Abbé Edgeworth, fulfilling the king's last request to remain by his side until the end, whispered the final words of comfort: "Son of St. Louis, ascend to heaven." These were the last words Louis XVI heard before the blade fell, ending his life in a matter of seconds, but leaving behind a legacy of forgiveness and reconciliation that would continue to echo through French history. The immediate impact of the execution and Louis XVI's last request was profound and lasting. Abbé Edgeworth, faithful to his promise, immediately began spreading the king's message of forgiveness, first to those present at the execution, and then through letters and conversations with other priests and religious leaders. The news spread quickly through Paris and then throughout France, creating a complex and sometimes contradictory reaction among the French people. For many revolutionaries, the dignity and forgiveness demonstrated by the king in his final moments created an unexpected feeling of discomfort and even remorse. They had expected the execution to bring a sense of triumph and justice, but instead found themselves confronted with disturbing questions about the morality of their actions and the consequences of their quest for revenge. Louis XV's final words also had a profound impact on the monarchists and conservatives who had supported the old regime. For them, the king's execution and his magnanimous response transformed him from a flawed and indecisive monarch into a Christian martyr whose sacrifice symbolized the highest values of French civilization. This transformation in public perception of the dead king would become an important factor in the eventual reaction against the excesses of the French Revolution. The psychological effects of Louis XV's last request extended far beyond France's borders. Royal courts throughout Europe were deeply shocked not only by the fact that a king had been publicly executed, but also by the dignified and forgiving manner in which he had faced his death. This reaction contributed to the formation of military coalitions against revolutionary France, as other monarchs feared that the French example might inspire similar movements in their own countries. Pope Pius VI, who had already condemned the French Revolution's attacks on the Catholic Church, declared Louis XVI a martyr and ordered special masses to be said for his soul throughout Catholic Europe. The contrast between the king's final message of forgiveness and the violence of his execution became a powerful symbol for those who opposed the radical changes sweeping through France. The long-term consequences of Louis XVI's last request proved even more significant than its immediate effects. His transformation from an unpopular monarch into a symbol of Christian virtue and royal dignity became a cornerstone of the legitimist movement that would work to restore the Bourbon monarchy to France. During the Restoration period following Napoleon's defeat, Louis XVI was officially recognized as a martyr, and his final words became an integral part of French royalist mythology. The king's emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation also influenced the development of French political culture in unexpected ways. Even Republican and democratic movements that rejected monarchical authority found themselves grappling with the moral example set by Louis XVI's final moments. His insistence on taking responsibility for his failures as a ruler while forgiving those who condemned him established a powerful precedent for political leadership that transcended partisan boundaries. Religious historians have noted that Louis XVI's last request represented one of the most remarkable examples of Christian forgiveness in modern European history. His ability to maintain his faith and offer genuine pardon to his enemies in the face of death inspired countless sermons, theological treatises, and spiritual reflections that spread throughout the Christian world. The king's final testimony became a touchstone for discussions about the relationship between political power and moral authority. The psychological impact on those who witnessed the execution was documented in numerous memoirs and personal accounts written years and even decades later. Many reported that the experience fundamentally changed their understanding of courage, dignity, and the power of forgiveness. Some former revolutionaries eventually converted to royalism or religious faith, citing the king's final moments as a turning point in their worldview. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of executing Louis XVI. Despite his professional experience and the hundreds of executions he would perform during the Terror, he consistently described the king's death as the most haunting moment of his career. In his later years, Sanson became increasingly religious and spent considerable time trying to reconcile his role in the king's death with his growing faith. The international diplomatic consequences of Louis XVI's execution and final request were equally significant. European monarchs who had initially been reluctant to intervene in French affairs became convinced that the revolutionary government posed an existential threat to the established order. The War of the First Coalition, which would dominate European politics for the next decade, was directly influenced by the shock and outrage created by the king's execution and the dignified manner of his death. French émigrés who had fled the revolution found in Louis XVI's final words a source of inspiration and legitimacy for their continued resistance to the revolutionary government. The king's message of forgiveness allowed them to frame their opposition not as a quest for revenge, but as a mission to restore the moral and spiritual values that he had embodied in his final moments. The contrast between Louis XVI's peaceful acceptance of death and the violence that would characterize the Terror became increasingly apparent as the revolution progressed. During the months following the king's execution, thousands of French citizens would face the guillotine, but few would demonstrate the composure and forgiveness that had marked the monarch's final moments. This contrast reinforced the perception that something essential had been lost with the king's death. Modern historians continue to debate the sincerity and significance of Louis XVI's last request. Some argue that his final words represented a genuine spiritual transformation that occurred during his months of imprisonment and reflection. Others suggest that his emphasis on forgiveness was a calculated political strategy designed to create moral problems for his enemies and inspire future resistance to the revolutionary government. Regardless of the king's motivations, the impact of his final request on French and European history cannot be denied. His transformation from an ineffective ruler into a symbol of Christian virtue and royal dignity influenced political and religious movements for generations. The values of forgiveness, reconciliation, and moral responsibility that he emphasized in his final moments became enduring themes in French political culture. The story of Louis XVI's last request also raises profound questions about the nature of leadership, moral authority, and personal transformation. His ability to find clarity and purpose in the face of death suggests that extreme circumstances can sometimes reveal hidden depths of character and wisdom that remain invisible during ordinary times. The king, who had struggled with indecision throughout his reign, discovered in his final hours a moral certainty that gave meaning to his death and inspiration to future generations. The legacy of Louis XVI's final words extends beyond their immediate historical context to touch on universal themes of forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of finding grace in the darkest moments of human experience. His last request reminds us that even in situations of ultimate powerlessness and injustice, individuals can choose responses that transcend their circumstances and speak to the highest aspirations of human nature. Today, more than 2 centuries after that cold January morning in Paris, Louis XV's last request continues to resonate with people facing their own struggles with forgiveness, responsibility, and moral courage. His example demonstrates that the manner in which we face our greatest challenges and defeats can sometimes matter more than our successes and achievements. In choosing forgiveness over bitterness, responsibility over self-justification, and concern for others over self-preservation, the condemned king achieved in death a moral victory that had eluded him in life. The guillotine that ended Louis XVI's earthly existence could not silence the power of his final message. His last request, spoken with dignity and sincerity in the shadow of death, became a testament to the enduring human capacity for growth, forgiveness, and spiritual transformation, even in the most desperate circumstances. It remains one of history's most powerful examples of how individuals can transcend their failures and limitations to leave behind a legacy that inspires and challenges future generations to embrace their highest moral possibilities. Louis XVI died not with a cry of vengeance, but with a whisper of forgiveness. His last words carried the weight of a crumbling empire, yet offered a glimpse of grace that history could never forget. From haunting his executioners to inspiring monarchs and martyrs, his final request echoed louder than any decree he'd signed. If his life was marked by hesitation, his death was a moment of unwavering conviction. Let his legacy challenge your view of leadership and sacrifice. Comment on how you see his final act and like if his story moved you, and subscribe to uncover more powerful turning points in history.